It's a little early for a beer for me, but not for Noé Gonzalez Lara.
¿Tú tomas chela? Sí. Sí. Es un poco temprano.
The heat's already coming on in this southern Veracruz town, where I've met up with Noé and other members of his band, Los Cojolites. They're probably the biggest San Jarocho band around today. They've toured the world and collaborated with Natalia Lafourcade, the Mexican pop star. Anyway, I've put a question to Noé. Does La Bamba mean anything?
Y la bamba es una palabra cubana. Bamba. La bamba es como un carro. La combi.
He says it comes from Cuba, and at least in Veracruz, it's like a form of transportation, like a collective bus. Now, never has this happened to me in my journalism career, but it so happened that I was able to get an instant fact check. A researcher from Cuba, Susana, was hanging out with us, and she says she's never heard the term Bamba in Cuba. At least it's no longer used there. I wanted to start this episode with this little exchange because it illustrates a running theme in my musical investigation of La Bamba. Seemingly straightforward questions prove to be anything but, and instead they lead to more questions. The word Bamba may seem like a promising entry point for an investigation of the origins of the song, since, after all, it's such an unusual word in Spanish. Considering that musicologists have long been drawn to study San Jarocho music, maybe you'd think basic questions around the etymology and origins of La Bamba would be settled by now, or that there'd at least be some kind of consensus. No. If anything, the theories and inaccuracies have multiplied in the age of the internet and AI. Like, okay, shifting back to the central question of my investigation, let's ask Google, what are the origins of La Bamba? All right, we got Gemini in the case. It says, historical consensus points to a slave uprising in 1683 known as the Bambaria. Whoa, so that's pretty cool. And following the links here, there's a paper about La Bamba in none other than the U.S. Library of Congress that cites this Bambaria theory. So, not to be a buzzkill, but it didn't take long in my research to discover that there is no historical evidence whatsoever for a slave uprising in Mexico called the Bambaria. And even less that this Bambaria somehow gave rise to the song La Bamba. And there's something else that's fishy about the theory. If you listen to the first episode, 1683 should ring a bell. It's the year of the pirate attack on Veracruz led by Laurencio. That's quite the coincidence, right? Now, there was a slave uprising in Veracruz in the 17th century, but it occurred decades earlier and far inland from the port of Veracruz. We'll get into that a bit later. With this Bambaria theory, it's like the dots are there, but they're connected in a completely speculative, almost farcical way. If I was going to make any progress plumbing the mystery of La Bamba's origins, I needed some solid clues. And for this, I needed primary sources, contemporaneous accounts of La Bamba, not articles and blogs and social media posts written long after the fact. And since my Spanish skills and my ability to find my way around the archives in Mexico were limited, I needed help. So I hired a researcher.
Soy Sofía Hernández Catalán, soy gestora cultural y
Sofía Hernández, who works as a cultural advisor in Mexico. So the earliest references to La Bamba as a song and or dance we came across were programs from the Coliseo Mexico, a famous theater in Mexico City, from the late 1790s and early 1800s. Now, this is old, but it's not that old. It places La Bamba well more than a century after the Laurencio pirate attack. And there's another wrinkle in these early references to La Bamba. They most often appear in the Coliseo programs as La Bamba Poblana. Poblano refers to Puebla, which is the name of the state and main city between Mexico City and Veracruz. And the thing is, I looked into this La Bamba Poblana, and apparently it involved dancing with big knives. In 1804, according to a newspaper article from the time, a couple of guys had a bit too much to drink at a bar, and they decided to dance the Bamba Poblana. One thing leads to another, and one of them ends up dead. There was a trial and everything. So this was not a very satisfying answer to the first documented reference to La Bamba as a musical number. I pursued many more leads, most of which ended up in rabbit holes. Did you know that there was a Visigoth king in Spain known as Bamba? And I was ready to accept that I probably wasn't going to find a documented reference to La Bamba from centuries back. Maybe it was just the quixotic nature of trying to trace the history of a folk song. By definition, folk songs are songs of the people, right? They are not properly composed, notated, and published, least of all those from an inherently improvisational music like son jarocho. But then Sofía called my attention to a document, Viaggio al Messico. Excuse my Italian. It's an account by a young friar of his travels in Mexico between 1761 and 1769. I started reading the friar's account, and well, I got sucked in. Shortly after joining the Capuchin order, the friar, known as Hilarion de Bergamo, was dispatched to Mexico to raise money for the order's mission in Tibet. And it was a pretty crap assignment, considering that Spain had just joined a war against Great Britain, and the waters off Spain were becoming a war zone. After spending months trying to gain passage to Mexico, the friar finally sets out, but barely a day into the journey, his ship comes under attack by a British warship. British soldiers commandeer his ship, and over several days, the friar is abused and ridiculed.
There was a broom boy so insolent that, while I was at the table having dinner with the others, he filled his mouth with water and surreptitiously settled himself in a high place and spat water on my head.
After many more travails, the friar finally makes it to the port of Veracruz.
There is nothing good there except for a great quantity of watermelons, which serve as refreshment in the great heat.
And on the whole, he finds the locals leave a lot to be desired.
Whether they are Creoles, Indians, mestizos, or mulattoes, they are lazy drinkers, thieves, deceivers, and sensual, and this also applies to the women.
And then he turns his attention to the local song and dance.
Their songs are, for the most part, dishonest, but their dances are worse, as they contain very indecent gestures.
Dishonest at the time apparently meant unholy and crude. He goes on to describe 3 types of dances. One is a feast and dance in the French style, favored by the, quote, noble and pure people. Another is called the sarao, and it features a jumble of, quote, songs, sounds, and drunkenness. And the third
is called fandango, which is the most universal among the common people, and in which they perform dances, which they call el Chuchumbe, la Bamba, and el Huesito, and they are the most dishonest.
This last sentence I had to read twice. The third is called fandango, which is the most universal among the common people, and in which they perform dances, which they call el Chuchumbe, la Bamba, y el Huesito. Here it was, at last, a reference to La Bamba, and it was placed squarely within the culture of Veracruz and the fandango, the communal song and dance parties, at the heart of son jarocho culture. Just 80 years after the Laurencio pirate attack, the account shows that La Bamba was already so well known that it reached the tender ears of a young Italian friar. There's another intriguing clue in the friar's account, Chuchumbe, the first song on the friar's naughty list. You see, Chuchumbe has the rare distinction of being a centuries-old folk song that we actually know the lyrics to. Why? Because a priest who witnessed the song and dance in Veracruz was so disturbed that he made a report to the Inquisition in Mexico City. That's right, the Inquisition had an office in Mexico City, and in 1766, the Tribunal of the Holy Office straight up banned Chuchumbe. The inquisitors decreed that the verses of the song were, quote,
extremely obscene and offensive, and have been sung accompanied by a dance no less scandalous and obscene, creating lust in the souls of the Christian people, harming their conscience, offending their morals and good customs, and contravening the mandates of the Holy Office.
The Holy Office in particular took issue with a verse that referenced a friar raising his cloak and showing his Chuchumbe. So what's Chuchumbe? The term is believed to come from the root kumbe or nakumba in the African Bantu language family, and it refers to the navel, and quite possibly the region a bit further south. Now, we don't know what Chuchumbe sounded like. There was no recording equipment in those days, after all. But there is a version of the song played today in Veracruz, popularized by the San Jarocho group Mono Blanco. Now, Mono Blanco almost certainly plays up the Caribbean vibe. And this kind of reminded me of what the musician Noé Gonzalez said at the beginning of the episode. Like Noé, the members of Mono Blanco are deeply rooted Veracruzanos. But there is this tendency, when making sense of this mysterious music they inherited, to look to the Caribbean. I decided to consult an expert on the subject of Cuban and Mexican folk music. Rolando Antonio Perez Fernandez, a musician and musicologist from Cuba and a professor at UNAM, Mexico's largest university. I put to him a version of the question I posed at the beginning. Does La Bamba come from Cuba?
No. The name is not familiar to us. It is not.
Rolando doesn't even think Chuchumbe came from Cuba, despite claims all over the internet that it's Afro-Cuban in origin.
There's no proof about that. I wrote that Chuchumbe could have been born in Mexico.
Could have been born in Mexico. Interesting. This all seemed to suggest an African influence in Mexico that runs very deep, but that's far from obvious today. So, what had I learned? One is that La Bamba indeed has been around in various forms for a very long time, that it could very well go back to the 17th century and maybe even further back. And two, La Bamba was rock and roll from the beginning, meaning it was viewed by the arbiters of morality in its time in much the same way rock was in its early days, transgressive and taboo for its seemingly African origins. I also realized that there was only so much I was going to learn in the archives, as it were. Official history, after all, tends to be written by those in power, and the people who brought La Bamba into being definitely weren't part of those circles. I needed to go deeper into the countryside of Veracruz, and all roads seemed to be pointing to the Fandango. That's next time. The La Bamba Pod was reported and produced by me, Ted Siefer. You can find links to some of the bands and musicians featured here in the show notes. As you can probably tell, this podcast is totally DIY. It's completely self-produced. If you want to support it, you can find links in the show notes, or you can go to ko-fi.com, that's ko-fi.com/LaBambaPod. And if you like the pod, please spread the word and subscribe on your platform of choice. Thanks for listening.
Qué bonita la bamba de madrugada cuando todos la bailan. Cuando todos la bailan en la enramada, allá arriba, allá arriba. Allá arriba, allá arriba, allá arriba iré. Yo no soy corinero, por ti seré, por ti seré, por